It was just after sunrise when I heard furious pounding at my door. I opened it to find two cops demanding to take my teenage son into custody, claiming he was a threat to the neighborhood. But what they didn't know was that my house wasn't empty. Behind me stood two of my closest friends, former Navy SEALs, who had come to visit. And the moment those officers tried to push past me, they realized they hadn't just come for a teenager, they had walked straight into a Navy SEAL standoff. The pounding on the door rattled the whole frame. My son, Ethan, froze halfway down the stairs, his face pale. He had no idea why the police would be at our house this early in the morning. But I knew. The HOA had been circling us for weeks, pushing harder with every ridiculous demand, and now they had finally escalated. I cracked the door, keeping the chain locked. Two uniformed officers glared back at me, their tone already aggressive. "Step aside. We need to speak with your son. Now." Their words weren't a request, they were a command. The taller one shoved a folded paper against the doorframe, claiming it was a notice, though he didn't offer me a clear look. "What's the charge?" I asked calmly, refusing to budge. "He's been disturbing the neighborhood, harassing residents with drones, trespassing. We have multiple complaints." The shorter cop leaned in closer, his voice sharp. "If you don't cooperate, we'll make this harder than it needs to be." Ethan's voice cracked from behind me. "Dad, what's happening?" I motioned for him to stay back. "Nothing you need to worry about, son." The taller officer shoved at the door, testing the chain. "Sir, don't make us force entry. You don't want this to turn ugly." That was the moment I knew this wasn't standard procedure. No warrant. No badge numbers shown. No protocol. Just intimidation. They weren't here to protect anyone, they were here to scare a teenage boy into submission on the HOA's behalf. I let the silence drag for a moment, holding their gaze without flinching. Years of discipline taught me not to blink first. "You'll need a warrant," I said firmly. The shorter officer sneered. "We don't need one if he's a threat." He raised his voice, angling toward Ethan. "Son, come out here now or we'll bring you out ourselves." That was the wrong move. Before I could even answer, heavy footsteps echoed from the living room. My two old friends, Dave and Leo, both former Navy SEALs, stepped into view. They had flown in the night before, and until now they had been quietly drinking coffee, letting me handle it. But hearing cops shout threats at my son? That was their breaking point. Dave leaned against the doorframe casually, arms crossed, his presence towering behind me. "You boys got a warrant?" he asked, voice cool but dangerous. The cops blinked, suddenly less confident. Leo spoke next, pulling his phone out like he was documenting everything. "Funny thing. You bark about procedure, but you haven't shown ID, you haven't shown paperwork, and you're threatening a minor. You want to explain that on record?" The taller cop shifted, his bravado cracking. He glanced at his partner, then back at the three of us inside. He had expected a nervous parent. What he found instead was a wall of calm, unshakable men trained for far worse than this. The tension was a live wire, the air thick with challenge. Ethan stayed silent at the top of the stairs, wide-eyed, as the realization spread across the officers' faces they had walked into the wrong house. And this confrontation was only just beginning. The taller officer cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders like he could still salvage authority. He shoved the folded paper against the gap in the door again. "This is an official HOA order. Your son has been surveilling the neighborhood. If you don't cooperate, we'll have no choice but to escalate." Behind me, Dave let out a sharp laugh. "HOA order?" His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Since when does a homeowners association issue warrants?" The shorter cop scowled, his hand drifting toward his holster. "Sir, step aside. Now." I could feel Ethan's fear radiating from the staircase. My son wasn't just scared of these men, he was confused. To him, cops were supposed to represent safety, not threats. And that was the hardest part, teaching him that uniforms don't always equal justice. I unlatched the chain just far enough to push the door wider, not enough to let them in, but enough to make a statement. Dave stepped closer, his frame filling the doorway. The morning light caught the tattoos peeking from beneath his sleeve, markers of a past most people wouldn't recognize until it was too late. "You boys want to rethink your tone?" Dave said evenly. "Because if you take one more step, you're gonna find yourselves way out of your depth." The shorter cop bristled, but the taller one hesitated. His eyes flicked to Leo, who had now stepped forward, phone still raised. "Recordings live," Leo announced. "Badge numbers, please." "Department." "Chain of command." "Unless you'd rather I just forward this to the sheriff's office right now?" The taller cop shifted his weight, clearly rattled. The false authority they'd walked in with was crumbling fast. They had expected an easy scare, a teenager intimidated into silence. Instead, they were standing nose to nose with men who lived and breathed confrontation. "Look," the taller one muttered, lowering his tone, "we can settle this quietly if the boy just hands over his drone." That was the tell. A legitimate cop would never say that. No paperwork. No procedure. Just a demand for property. Dave leaned in, his voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous calm. "You came here under the color of law, threatening a minor, waving HOA papers like they're warrants. That's impersonation, harassment, and trespass. And let me make this crystal clear, you don't scare us. Not one bit." The shorter cop's hand was still on his holster, but his knuckles whitened. He was nervous, not because of weapons, but because of presence. Years of combat training radiated off my friends like heat. Every movement they made was measured, deliberate, and absolutely controlled. I spoke again, keeping my tone level but unyielding. "My son isn't going anywhere with you. You don't have a warrant. You don't have authority. What you do have is about 10 seconds to leave my property before I call real law enforcement to deal with you." Silence stretched, thick as steel wire. Finally, the taller one tugged at his partner's sleeve. "Let's go. We'll be back." They retreated down the driveway, but not before Leo zoomed in with his phone, catching their plates, their faces, every detail. Ethan finally exhaled, gripping the banister like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Dad, they were really going to take me." I turned back, my jaw tight. They tried. But they didn't know who they were walking into. Dave clapped me on the shoulder, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess the HOA didn't read the fine print. You don't send hired cops after a SEAL's family." The front door shut with a solid, echoing click. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, one thing was certain, my son wasn't alone, and the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. For a few hours after the confrontation, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Ethan tried to settle into his routine, pretending like schoolwork could drown out what had just happened. But I could see the tension in the way he moved, every creak of the house making him flinch. Sarah brewed coffee in the kitchen, hand steady, but her eyes flicked constantly toward the window. She had seen enough patients roll into her ER after botched authority encounters to know this wasn't over. Dave broke the silence first, pacing like a caged lion. "Those weren't real cops. At least not operating under anything legitimate." Leo nodded, scrolling through the footage he'd captured. Plates came back dirty. No match in the county system. Which means either they borrowed the car, or someone's funding them off the books. I sat at the table, Ethan across from me. "Son," I said carefully, "you need to understand. This wasn't about you. It was about leverage. They want to scare us into folding." Ethan swallowed hard. "Over what? A drone? We've lived here for years. Why now?" Dave answered before I could. "Because your dad's not easy to push. HOA types thrive on fear. Most people cave. You don't. So they escalated." Ethan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "That was my boy, shaken, yes, but there was steel forming behind his eyes. Then, Right on cue, a shadow moved outside the window. Leo's head snapped up. He was already moving before anyone else registered it, phone in hand, slipping to the side of the house. Seconds later, he returned with his jaw clenched. Drone. Smaller this time. Civilian grade, cheap lens, probably controlled from close range. Somebody's watching the house. Dave cracked his knuckles. They want a war of intimidation? Fine. Let's show them what happens when you pick the wrong house. I held up a hand. Not yet. We play this smart. Evidence, exposure, patience. They overstep, and we make sure the sheriff sees everything. But patience, as it turned out, wasn't in the HOA's vocabulary. The very next day, Ethan was pulled out of class by the school resource officer. They claimed there had been anonymous reports of him threatening other students. Nothing stuck, the accusations were vague, laughable even, but the message was clear. They weren't going to stop at our front door. They were going to follow my son everywhere, poisoning his name, trying to corner him where he had no protection. When he walked out of that school with his head down, and I saw two familiar cars idling across the street, my blood went cold. The same two men, the fake cops, pretending to be parked casually, eyes locked on Ethan. Dave slid his sunglasses down as we pulled up. Tails sloppy. They want us to know they're watching. Good, I said. Then we'll let them know they picked the wrong target. That night, Sarah typed up every detail into a growing file. Dates, times, faces, license plates. Leo uploaded footage to a secure drive. Dave mapped out patterns from the patrols they'd spotted circling the neighborhood. Piece by piece, the picture became clear. This wasn't just HOA harassment. It was an organized pressure campaign, intimidation dressed up as authority, aimed at breaking us down until we gave them what they wanted. But they hadn't counted on my son having more than just his parents watching over him. He had Navy SEALs, and every day they pushed harder, we pushed back smarter. The HOA thought they were tightening the noose. What they didn't realize was that they were walking straight into our trap. The pattern was clear by the third day. Every morning, Ethan left for school under watchful eyes. Cars lingered at corners. Strangers loitered near the bus stop. The intimidation was no longer subtle, it was constant, heavy, relentless. Ethan tried to act normal, earbuds in, backpack slung over one shoulder. But the slump in his posture betrayed him. He was carrying a weight no teenager should, the knowledge that grown men wanted to snatch him like prey. That morning, I trailed him with Dave and Leo in the truck, keeping a discreet distance. Sarah had insisted on staying home to log everything, every movement, every license plate, every shadow that passed the house. Halfway to school, it happened. A black SUV screeched around the corner, cutting off Ethan's path. Two doors flew open. The same fake cops jumped out, hands already reaching. Ethan Hale, the taller one, barked. "You're coming with us." Ethan froze, eyes wide. A dozen students scattered from the sidewalk, shrieking at the sudden chaos. Before either man could touch him, Dave and I were out of the truck. Years of training kicked in like muscle memory, no wasted movement, no hesitation. I reached Ethan first, planting myself between him and the officers. "Back! Off!" The shorter cop sneered. Interfering with police action is a crime. His hand twitched toward his holster, but Leo was already there, phone raised, recording. "Go ahead," Leo said coolly. "Draw it. See how fast the sheriff watches this live feed." The taller one lunged anyway, trying to grab Ethan's arm. That was his last mistake. Dave intercepted, his grip snapping around the man's wrist like steel. In one fluid motion, he twisted, leveraged, and had the officer on his knees before he could even gasp. Controlled force, enough to disable, not destroy. Police action? Dave growled. "You're not cops. You're thugs in borrowed uniforms." The shorter one stepped back, suddenly aware of the audience. Phones were out everywhere. Students, parents, bystanders, half the block was recording. I spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. These men are impersonating officers. They've been harassing my son under orders from the HOA. And now they just tried to abduct him in front of witnesses. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The shorter fake cop's face went pale. He grabbed his partner's arm, yanking him upright. "This isn't over," he hissed. "No," I said firmly. "It's over for you." Sirens wailed in the distance. Real ones this time. The sheriff's deputies had been on alert ever since Leo forwarded the earlier footage. This time, they arrived within minutes. The sight of the cruisers rolling in was enough to shatter the last of the imposters' confidence. They bolted for their SUV, tires screeching as they fled the scene. But they didn't get far. A deputy cruiser cut them off at the intersection, boxing them in. Within moments, both men were face down on the pavement, cuffed and humiliated under the eyes of an entire neighborhood. Ethan clutched my arm, still trembling. "Dad, they were really gonna take me. Right there. In front of everyone." I pulled him close. "They tried. But we don't break easy." Dave adjusted his jacket, eyes locked on the fleeing HOA board members who had lingered just far enough away to watch. They thought they could use intimidation. Instead, they just handed us everything we need. Leo stopped recording only when the deputies formally logged the arrests. Chain of evidence secured. Cameras rolling. Witnesses everywhere. The HOA's done. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Exposing the hired thugs was one battle. The real war was against the machine behind them, the entitled board members who had signed off on weaponizing fear. The HOA had come for my son. They'd brought fake cops, threats, and public humiliation. Now, they were about to learn the one lesson no amount of power could erase: you never come after a Navy SEAL's family. 2 nights after the attempted abduction, the HOA board called an emergency community meeting. They wanted to spin the narrative before word spread too far. Flyers were shoved into mailboxes, warnings about a dangerous family disturbing the peace plastered across the neighborhood. But they made one mistake. They underestimated how much truth we'd already gathered. The community center buzzed with tension. Dozens of homeowners sat in folding chairs, whispering nervously. At the front, Karen Lawson, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, stood in a tailored suit, flanked by her loyal board members. Her smile was tight, rehearsed, but her eyes flicked nervously across the room. She raised her voice with practiced authority. "Neighbors, thank you for coming on such short notice. We have a serious problem. The Hale family has brought disruption, intimidation, and even military friends into our quiet community. They are a danger to our way of life." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I rose slowly from my seat, Ethan at my side, Sarah holding a thick folder of evidence. Dave and Leo leaned against the back wall, their presence alone enough to silence half the room. "You're right about one thing," I said evenly. "There is a danger in this community. But it's not my family." Karen's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" Leo stepped forward, holding up his phone. The screen lit with the footage, the fake cops at my door, threatening Ethan, waving fake papers. Gasps echoed through the hall. He swiped to the next clip, the school abduction attempt. The crowd erupted with outrage. "This," Leo announced, voice booming, "is what your board has been funding. Intimidation. Impersonation. Endangering children." Karen's face drained of color. Those men weren't working for us." Sarah cut her off, holding up the folder. "Financial records. Payments from HOA accounts funneled into a shell company. That shell company paid the men you just saw arrested. Deputies confirmed it this morning." The room exploded with shouts. Neighbors stood up, pointing fingers, demanding answers. Dave moved forward now, voice low but deadly. "Karen, you sent hired muscle after a teenager. You brought fake cops into a SEAL's home. And you thought nobody would notice?" He shook his head. "You picked the wrong fight." Karen tried to shout over the uproar, but her board members were already shrinking back, distancing themselves. One even stood, declaring he hadn't known about the payments. The facade crumbled in real time. I looked directly at her, my voice calm and final. You wanted to break us with fear. Instead, you exposed yourself. You don't run this neighborhood anymore. You answer to it. The sheriff's deputies, waiting at the back, stepped forward. Karen Lawson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and endangerment of a minor. The community center went silent as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Her perfect composure shattered, her voice rising in panicked protests. But nobody believed her now. As she was let out, Ethan gripped my hand tightly. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by pride. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood stood together. Not behind Karen. Not behind fear. But behind truth. And in that moment, the HOA's reign ended, because they had dared to come for my son, and found Navy SEALs waiting. The neighborhood felt different the next morning. For the first time in years, people walked their dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Parents let their kids ride bikes freely. The fear that had ruled every block, every driveway, was gone. Karen Lawson and her cronies weren't just embarrassed, they were finished. Stripped of authority, facing criminal charges, their names now whispered with shame instead of power. The HOA that once acted like a private army was disbanded, its bank accounts frozen under investigation. For my family, the relief was overwhelming. Ethan could finally breathe again. No more threats. No more fake cops pounding at the door. Just peace. But what mattered most was the way the community came together. People who had once been silent out of fear now stood shoulder to shoulder, protecting each other. It wasn't about Navy SEALs or military training, it was about unity. About refusing to let corruption bully families into submission. As I watched Ethan laugh with his friends that afternoon, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about my son. It was about every neighbor who'd ever been intimidated into silence. And sometimes, it takes one family standing up to show everyone else that they can fight back too. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: never underestimate the power of truth. And never underestimate the strength of a community that decides it won't be pushed around anymore. Because when people come together, no HOA board, no bully, no Karen, can ever stand against them. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more wild HOA and entitled people stories, and don't forget to comment below. Would you have handled Karen differently, or was this the perfect takedown? Share your thoughts, I read every single one.